Hand it over to Gisli to introduce one of the best panels of the day.
The panels keep getting better and better, right? It's either that or all the good food we're eating that's getting us more relaxed, and we just think everything's getting better. But this particular panel is called Open Innovation, and we're lucky to have here today two great guys to take a look at that with us. But open innovation is a concept that is not necessarily brand new, but it's gotten a lot of interest lately. And we're seeing, innovation change from happening just inside the locked doors of particular organizations into more being a collaborative effort where the boundaries between the organizations working on the innovation start to blur. And these new models have become quite popular. We've seen people using competitions and grand challenges and other nice approaches for doing this, and they seem to be pretty good at solving some of the more complex problems we have, because we often within our organizations get stuck in thinking within the box that we are used to working within. So we have limitations in our thinking that leads us not to necessarily find those innovative solutions to the problems. Now, I work as the emergency response director of an organization called NetHope. And NetHope is a consortium of 35 of the leading international NGOs. And we were founded actually 11 years ago around the concept of open innovation and open collaboration between organizations. Because what our founding members realized was that by working together on solving some of the complex issues related to how to do the work that our NGOs do more effectively using technology, they could actually achieve certain economies of scale. They could get better partnerships. And we've kind of become, over those last 11 years, almost like a neutral space between the NGOs, between the donors, and between private sector of working together on various innovative processes and products and so on. Yet, at the same time, within many of the kind of international organizations and federal organizations, we have these strict procurement rules and procedures for how to do new things that are stopping us from doing some of those innovative things. But there are people who have found ways around those things. We're lucky to have with us today two people who have quite unique insight into this. We have Fabian, who co-leads the UNICEF Innovation Unit and is doing some amazing stuff there. And Nigel, who currently is Google and leads their crisis response, but he's been here and there before and can tell us a bit about that. But we'll start by them giving us an overview of some of the examples of how they've been doing innovation in an open manner and some of the kind of projects that they've worked on. And then we'll go to questions. But you guys want to fight for who gets to start?
Chris goes first.
All right. We'll fight about something more important. Thank you very much, Gisli, and thank you.
Check that everybody can.
Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Do I need to be talking into this to be heard online? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And thanks, John, for inviting me. So, as Gisli said, I co-lead the innovation unit in UNICEF. We're a small team in headquarters. We're about 6 people now. We support a team of 35 globally. And I wanted to tell you sort of 3 stories about the type of innovation we've seen, sort of around the space of real-time information, and the type of needs and opportunities we've faced over the last 2 years as part of a 15,000-person bureaucracy that exists in 135 countries. UNICEF's work is obviously divided partially in the development space and then partially in the humanitarian space. That last year we were in over 220 emergencies in about 90 countries. But most of the work that our team does focuses on the development side of things and in sort of UNICEF's traditional expertise areas, things like health and child protection and education. And so the three stories I wanted to tell you, and then I'll, at the end of it, talk about 5 principles that we've learned the hard way through sort of pain and suffering over the last few years of how to make these types of engagements work. And the 3 stories I wanted to tell you, the first one I guess we'll start in the space of health and looking at community health workers. Community health workers are sort of the largest volunteer labor force in the world. We have no idea how many of them there are, but they support frontline health work in countries around the world. And in sub-Saharan Africa, they might be involved in doing things like nutritional status surveillance, figuring out if a kid is acutely malnourished or moderately malnourished. In India or elsewhere in the world, they might be doing things like antenatal care and referring mothers to various types of health facilities depending on their needs. And these community health workers are given some amount of training. Sometimes it's an hour of training or 2 hours, sometimes it's 3 days, and it depends on the place where they are and the kind of funding that's gone into them. And UNICEF has always worked with community health workers because in countries like Malawi, where there are 8 pediatricians, you need somebody to do that frontline healthcare delivery. And about a year and a half ago, the governments of Zimbabwe and Malawi came to our country offices there, and they said, you know, we have a big problem with our community health workers. The data that they're collecting on early infant diagnosis and the test for whether or not there's HIV present in the baby's blood isn't coming in fast enough into the capital, and it isn't getting back out. The results of that test aren't getting back out to rural Zambia quickly enough. And it's because it's coming in on paper, and the paper has to be aggregated and on a motorcycle and a donkey and a person and a bus. It takes about 30 days to get into the capital city, where it goes through a test that needs to be a DNA test, because you can't just do a blood test for an infant. There's too much of the mother's blood in it. So it does a DNA test at the capital city and goes back, taking another 30 days. So it's a 60-day round trip for this test turnaround time. And the connection to crowdsourcing is coming up in a minute. But that's too long of an amount of time for a test result, especially when it's around an area like HIV and AIDS, because if you don't get a baby on antiretrovirals by its first year of birth, its chance of dying goes up by 30%, goes up by 60% 6 months later. So time is really essential. This is a time-bound process. And what we saw was that if we put, so the end of this story, after our team did a sort of a therapy session with everybody involved, and we said, tell us about what you love and what you hate and what your dreams are for the future. And it turned out that nobody had the full vision of this process. They all saw some part of early infant diagnosis. And we found then that by putting our team into rural Zambia, where the community health workers are, by connecting them with a team of user experience designers from Frog Design, a large international design firm, by connecting them with students from various universities, and of course with the Ministry of Health, and this comes to this partner management and relationship management thing. By involving all of those people at the point of need, we were able to build a system using text messages that sent the message back faster, right? So problem half solved. 30 days to get up, 0 days to get back. That's kind of nice. When they were there, the community health workers said, you know, there's something else we need. They said, UNICEF keeps telling us that you have to do this stuff at 6 days, 6 weeks, and 6 months, various interventions with the child, but we don't remember, we don't really know what 6 weeks is. We don't count time that way. So the UNICEF people are like, what, you've been, for years, you've been doing this stuff, and you haven't done the second 2 parts of the 3-part training? And they're like, nope, we don't know what 6 days is. So we don't know what 6 weeks is. That's pretty easy, because it's easy to build a reminder app for your phone, right, which also works over text message. So if somewhere in the capital city, a little thing goes on in a server somewhere, boom, community health worker gets a message. It doesn't say 6 weeks.
Like a little closer?
It doesn't say 6 weeks. It says just do this. It doesn't say 6 months. It says just do this. Is that better? They built a calendar app for these community health workers. That was kind of interesting. That allowed them to do their job better. They liked it. Because of that, they sort of wanted to use the system more. The third thing that the community health workers said was, you do this training for us and it takes an hour, it takes 3 days or whatever, but we forget a lot of it because it's done in a really kind of roughshod way, and all the partners are paying different amounts of money for different parts of training, and we forget stuff like the fact that you can press a kid's skin, and if the blood doesn't come back fast enough, that's edema. It's considered to be a sign of severe acute malnutrition and often of moderate malnutrition. There's certain things like that that we forget, and we have questions, but we don't want to ask the next person up in the health system. Even though we're part of a volunteer labor force, we still have these issues of, like, do we look good? Do we look bad? Whatever. We don't want our boss, even if it's an informal boss, to know that we don't remember something. So our developers built Twitter for the community health workers. They built this little Zambian version of Twitter for community health workers, where they can text each other. The other people go through their cohorts of training and ask simple questions of each other, which is also kind of interesting. The connection of all of this to kind of grassroots crowdsourcing and information flows is that I have a hypothesis, and I'll put my hypothesis out here. My hypothesis is that unless you create something that's valuable for a user, unless you create an information loop that returns value to a person, crowdsourcing doesn't work at all. And the information loop that we created here wasn't even a loop between the user and us and back to them. It was a loop between users. It was community health workers saying, hey, we've got a bunch of kids. They all have acute watery diarrhea. We don't remember how much oral rehydration salt to give them, right? Diarrhea is one of the 5 main causes of preventable child deaths. It's very easy to prevent death from dehydration from diarrhea by giving oral rehydration salts. Sometimes it's hard to remember how to mix those salts, sugar, salt, water, certain proportion. If you suddenly see a bunch of chatter on the Twitter, I'm probably not supposed to say that. We didn't build Twitter. We built a product that uses text messages and allows community health workers to work together in groups that they can dynamically form and leave in Zambia. If you suddenly see a lot of them asking each other questions like, how do you put oral rehydration salt together in this environment with these ingredients? And they're all in a certain district. You know that there are cases of diarrhea there. You know that there's some waterborne illness. And you, in a place where there are only 8 pediatricians, where you have huge resource constraints, can respond to that specific area. UNICEF can't do 100% of everything everywhere. Nobody can. And increasingly, whether it's in disaster work or in development work, we're trying to figure out how to gear these precious few resources, right? So by giving community health workers a tool that they can use to do their job better, by giving them something that they want to use, by looking at the data that's coming out of that, you create an information loop for them. And you pull some of the data from that. You pull some information which allows you to do better programming, better real-time policy adjustments, and things like that. So that's the story. I guess I'm only going to tell you one story. That's the story. I have 2 other good stories if anybody wants to hear afterwards. But the principles, and that's one of many types of projects that our team has worked on. And if anybody wants, if you want to go to unicefstories.org, you can go and see other stories. The principles that we've seen drive this type of technology engagement where we're looking at working with not 10,000 people, because that's too small for UNICEF, or 100,000, because I'm not interested in 100,000 people, but millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people. That's the type of scale that interests me. The types of approaches that we've seen to building those solutions are that technology is always a tiny part of it, right? It's 1% of it. That this stuff has to be useful, right? And the 5 principles that we've centered around in building solutions, first of all, are centered around the user. Be user-centric. Work with the user in a place where the user is. We actually don't know in Lusaka what problems people are facing in capital city of Malawi. We don't know what people are facing in the field. Our offices don't necessarily know the full scope of a system. They may not know that parts of the training aren't being remembered. The community health worker knows what they know and what they don't know. So we build stuff with them. That's 1, so user-centric. 2, this stuff has to be scalable. And in order to scale, it has to be built by people in the area where you're going to scale it, right? If the fulcrum is too close to us, everything we build at headquarters fails. I've never built anything. Our team is, and they're amazing. Our team are such good developers and the best developers in the world that I've ever worked with. And everything we build in New York fails. Build it in a way that it can be maintained and taken up by people in the country that you're building it for. So in Nigeria, we built a big system to track bednet distribution using text messages. Great, it tracked 30 million bednets. That's a lot of bednets. That system was taken by the Nigerian developers who worked in the open source framework that built it, and they now have something else that does polio compliance monitoring and all this other stuff that we weren't even involved in. The 3rd thing is fail a lot. You're going to fail a ton of times at this. It's really hard. And the technology and the users and the people and the scale of humans aren't a silver bullet for any of these problems. They're things that will make you fail. So we try to fail quickly and try to fail quite openly, but we do fail a lot. The 4th principle that we've seen is really important is the principle of openness. So I will not work with anybody who's not completely open source in the products that they're developing for us. If I'm paying for it, I want it to be open source. I want the content from it. If we're generating photos or things like that, I want that to be open. Not the data. The data that's collected in Zimbabwe by the Ministry of Health belongs to the Ministry of Health. That's very important. It doesn't belong to UNICEF or anybody else. But the technology, the recipe for building that cake is public domain and open. And then the sort of last principle, the binding thing that ties all of those together, is the principle of collaboration. We're very lucky as an agency. We have money and time to put into this type of work, but we cannot do all of this ourselves. We're not fundamentally a technology agency. There are groups that have technologists that look at emergency response, or groups that have technologists that look at other things. There are groups that have designers who are really bored designing the products that they're designing right now that really want to be doing something else. There are NGOs that are working on specific problem sets. Unless we work together on these problems, which are some of the most interesting problems in the world, that's why you can get the good brains around them, because they're really tough problems. And unless we do that in a collaborative way, we know that we're not going to push anything forward. So those are the 5 sort of underlying principles that we've seen as important to drive this work. And I'm happy to have a discussion and talk in more detail about how we've gotten to them organizationally over the last few years, and some of the hurdles and some of the actual real opportunities that we found working in the big organization. But I guess I would turn it over to Nigel and hear his part of the story next.
I should have gone first.
Nigel, it's okay. Christian is being called a rock star on Twitter right now.
Yeah, what's up? Hey, Twitter. Take that, Robert
So you had a
Fabricant.
tough one to follow.
So it's both a tough one to follow in terms of talking about the scale and the impact of the problems, but also about the fact that most of the principles I was going to talk about are much the same, which is
Rockstar high five.
which hopefully is confirmation and validation. So I want to just first by saying thanks for everybody here for coming, for the organizers, for Wilson for hosting us, etc., and the sponsors. But it's interesting for me, who has quite a substantial history in this technology humanitarian response space, going back sort of 10 years now, which is not the longest history in the room by any means. But working for a bunch of different agencies in the UN, commercial, research, and also design and so forth across the spectrum, if you like. And why sort of bringing to some of the examples I'll talk about are actually going back into the past, and some of them are reinforcing the same principles Chris mentioned. So before we had the ability to generate easy text message systems, for instance, some of the same principles still applied for success. And I'll just reiterate the things that Christian mentioned. But just to talk about the focus of the work, I think, and what I see as an important guiding principle is that it's about empowering citizens with information they need to keep themselves safe and protect their families and know what's happened to their loved ones, right? And that's, if you take that as your starting point, not institutional success, right? The mandates and other things we have are a way to gauge and measure and plan for those kind of outcomes. It puts the users, and the word beneficiary has fortunately about 5 years ago mostly got blasted from my mind, though someone reminded me of it this morning. It puts the users, the affected people, hopefully heart and center of what you're trying to do and understanding what's going on. So that's my number one principle. Chris mentioned it too, which is that the people affected are at the center of it, and you actually have to walk in their shoes, design in their shoes. And another thing that Chris mentioned that is really critically important, which comes out of any time you're doing this kind of work, of course, is you've got to give something to get something. And it doesn't matter whether you're trying to get collaboration working between agencies, which I did for years in the field trying to collect information from people. You would never get information from people unless they felt they had a stake in it or they got something back. And it can be as simple as a notional reward, right? It works best if it's actually a real reward satisfying a need that they have. But there's some sense that it's not a purely extractive industry that you're involved in. And most of our data collection processes, when we're trying to collect information from people in affected regions, is, oh, give it to us and we'll just make your life better by doing better ourselves. That's an extractive process, right? The connection isn't there to citizens. So that's so very clearly for me that's something that comes out. And so what I wanted to talk about briefly was, I think there's sort of two modes that we think about when we talk about collecting grassroots to governance, right? Governments, which innovation plays a role in. One is which about providing information to people. That's kind of the obvious role that we think we've got. And we turn that around a bit and say, okay, I want to source information from people. And we connect the two because I source information to then provide it back to them. And that's my virtuous cycle I'm hoping to get going. And the give something to get something, as I said, and as Chris mentioned, is that loop is way too disconnected for people to realize the value in doing it well and participating. They have no stake in it if it comes way too late for them. So closing the loop is great. And I think the open innovation approaches that open government and government 2.0 and everybody talks about, and government as a platform, is about moving from I'm going to be the direct provider, that I know how best to reach out to people, to saying actually I'm going to enable people to be provided with information. It is a step back, but I'm allowing a whole pile of other methods to flourish on top of the information I provide, because I don't possibly know all the ways or all the best ways to get this to people. You can't step back completely so there's no way for the public to get information. But if you talk about how do I provide, if you step back a bit, then you would enable a whole ecosystem to potentially flourish. There's different questions about how you get that to flourish. But if you can't even enable it, and this is where we start talking about technical terms like APIs and open data license and other things that are prerequisites. But the real prerequisite is actually the intention that I'm enabling rather than doing, right? And that's a very different change in mindset. And similarly, rather than sourcing directly, I'm enabling the sourcing, right? I'm enabling these things to get connected. And so that's again a different mindset to directly going and asking people questions. Now, how technically you do that, whether you fund people to run surveys or whether you contract them directly, or even if you do it yourself, it's different. That's fine. That's implementation rather than philosophy. And the third piece is that just enabling sourcing, because it means that communities can then potentially source themselves if you're able to close the loop. It makes it really hard though, because if you're enabling sourcing, then you're one step back from providing them with value and feedback. So there's a dichotomy there that's really hard to try and figure out how to close, right? And so that I don't have a great answer for, right? There's a bunch of different methods there that I think the real answer is actually towards what Chris mentioned before, which is about getting close and doing in situ work. You can't do that local work and the enablement, the step beyond the enablement, you can't do remotely in headquarters. You can build APIs in headquarters, you can build data stores in headquarters, but you can't build the front-end systems, processes, tools, the social bit, the cultural bit, the community bit remotely. Right? The reward cycle is local. It's not remote. Right? And the thing that I like about talking about enabling provision and enabling sourcing, which enables an open ecosystem, you hope, and innovation, is that you're also enabling people to connect to each other, rather than you being the only way that things get communicated and connected. So you're empowering communities to innovate themselves. Again, how you fund that, how you make that happen, what the best practices are, slightly separate thing. But you can't do that unless you actually step back a little bit and think about it in that way. Running short of time, so I wanted to talk a little bit forward. A couple of concrete examples, perhaps. Right? I did want to also say I'm so excited by the fact that groups like Chris's UNICEF group exists. Because prior to 2006, right, various of us in the UN working in the field trying to do innovative things had absolutely no model for how to do anything innovative. There was no chance to fail, as Chris mentioned, right? And one of the things the UNICEF Design Lab and Innovation Lab has brought, and UNOCHA and other groups have been thinking about it but never quite implemented, is actually a willingness to try and fail. And it's a really hard thing to do in the humanitarian disaster space, right? And you've got to pick and choose where and how, but it's a critical component of getting any of this right. So a couple of examples, and then I'll come back to sort of summarizing on the words. One example, which is not tied into a government practice, though you can imagine how it is the Person Finder project that Google Crisis Response built in response to the Haiti earthquake. So it was enabled by some open data standards, because Ka-Ping Yi, who's now one of my colleagues, in 2005 for Hurricane Katrina went, hey, there's all this missing persons information that's not being shared. We need a data standard format to share it. And I actually in 2005 contributed to the standard, which was a bit bizarre to me that several years later I'm working with him again. And then in 2010, when the Haiti earthquake came, various organizations, I should say, like Microsoft and Yahoo and others, tried to build systems that made use of that for sharing information with the Red Cross and others. And it sort of floundered. Right? There was no way to sort of build these institutional systems in a way that we figured. But in 2010, it came that, okay, actually we've got an open data standard, let's implement it. And so a bunch of Googlers built an open source tool, released it to others, and had others contribute. So in 72 hours, I think, is the notice on record for collecting and sharing missing persons information. I'm okay, or I'm missing someone. Right? Or I'm not okay, may well come into there too. But usually, hopefully, it's I'm okay. And it's developed, it's grown, it's connected with a few other systems via an open API. To the extent that over 800,000 people in the Japan earthquake in 2011, over 800,000 people were entered into the system. And more than 80,000 matches were made for people who found each other through it. It's not necessarily the only way they found each other, but there's very good anecdotal and some statistical evidence that tens of thousands of people found each other for the first time that way as a missing persons tool. And I don't know how the stats compare to the Red Cross's systems and other things like that. But where it becomes open and interesting is that we provided an API. And that means that others can build on top of it. Now, privacy reasons mean you've got to be very careful. Your licensing and everything else is really important. But by doing an open API, we've enabled a whole pile of innovation to happen. But it's intriguing to me that the innovation that happened around it, by having an open system that people could look at and view, enabled the connection to the offline experience. So I mentioned to some people yesterday that in Japan what spontaneously happened, as happens in all large disasters where there are lots of missing persons, is that locals put notices on local notice boards saying, have you seen this person? And the lists from shelters were posted there as well. These people are here. So that people could socialize around it. Happened in 9/11, it happens all over the world. It happened in the Philippines, in Mindanao in the floods in 2011. The local police stations often act as this focal point for collecting and sharing the official contact of this. But it's an offline process that's very natural. What people did was took photos of it and put it onto Picasa. And a bunch of volunteers came and literally built their own workflow just by commenting in the comments section of Picasa and entered that into Person Finder and also noted back when there was a match. So that the locals who were tracked on, I took this photo, I'm going to work on this, actually then went back to the notice board and said, hey, this person's been found. So they connected the online and the offline by having a way to have a quite an open entry and an attachment system. And a similar thing happened in Mindanao, where a local engineer, a local software person, not even a software person, someone with an internet connection locally in one of the villages, basically wrote to us and said, hey, I can go to the police and take them a list, and I can enter their list. And we set up a whole online-offline connection that way. And so that's not possible without some degree of openness and forethought in your system, but critically, the innovation happens locally. And I could give more examples. There's some really interesting ones, I think, that are enabling. The biggest threat, I think, though, is that if you don't open your systems, you're actually going to get left behind. If you don't practice support an open innovation principle using open data, open standards, licensing, and what I call inverse incubation, which is you innovate in the field. Incubation is usually you go out, learn all you can, come back and incubate, and then take that out and test. That's the standard software development practice for incubation in big companies and governments and others. Inverse incubation is you take your engineers to the field and do it there, and your designers to the field. Even better, if you do something like Instead's iLab did and various other groups, is you actually set up your development team in the field and they actually explicitly solve local needs. Sustainability is an issue, all kinds of problems like that. I can't remember where I was going to. I had the next point I was going to make. So I'll probably leave it at about that. And just to reinforce the principles that I said there, openness, inverse incubation or incubating in the field. I think Chris's note about design being a critical part of it is really relevant. We set up a Humanitarian Design Lab at Parsons School for Design, and that's been incredibly successful in, interestingly enough, taking the goals and ideas of the clients, if you like, who came in, the World Bank, the Red Cross and others, to come in and say, hey, I've got a problem, let's work with you on it. And it got turned around to a completely different problem that was actually being solved in the end, purely because we're actually able to go out and do a design approach with the people who are actually the users or the subjects or the participants. And I think Chris would have seen that endlessly with the NYU program that they've worked with. And ultimately, as Chris said, collaboration. And it's very important for me as someone who's worked in big institutions as well as some startups to be able to say that you don't know everything. It's very tempting in large organizations to say, I'll solve the problems I know how to solve. Whereas actually most of the innovation and the problems you need to solve are actually outside of your boundaries. And so you've got to be humble in that sense. It's not just collaboration, it's actually being humble about your strength of your knowledge and where you learn from. A lot of those are some motherhood statements, but there's a bit of practice behind it. And as per Chris, I've got about 4 other examples to talk about concretely later or during the Q&A.
Excellent. Rockstar was not the word being used on Twitter, but lots of love. So, one of the questions that I want to ask before I open it up to the audience and people in the online is, Chris, getting a lab inside a big organization in the UN, where they have very difficult procurement rules and various other bureaucratic things to stop you from doing anything. What were some of the lessons you guys learned while you were trying to get that working?
We're being live streamed, right?
Yes.
Chatham House rules don't apply when the web's involved.
Hi, senior management.
You said you like to fail and
Yeah,
learn
no.
from those things.
Let
Are you
them-
willing
let
to
them
share?
come. Right. I think one of the things that we do very poorly as UNICEF, and I can speak less generally for the rest of the UN, but definitely as UNICEF, is value ourselves right. UNICEF is an amazing organization, and it actually has a storehouse of value that it often overlooks. And that value is intellectual value and knowledge value, and most importantly, problem value. We have some of the best challenges in the world, and we don't often know how to express that. So when we do a partnership with somebody, we just sort of pay them a lot of the time. That's a partnership, right? There are other types of partnerships, but often that's a partnership. And that's because we often overlook this value in the network of 135 countries in some of the most difficult operating environments in the world. And what value that has to a technology company or a design company or an analyst or research or consultancy company. And so one of the things that we've done in order to build these labs, so we have our little team. We have 7 labs now in countries around the world. We'll have 12 by the end of the year. And one of the things we've done that's been really an interesting process to learn from is started to barter with our network value, started to barter with our problems. So we'll go to a company like ThoughtWorks or Frog, and these are 2 big partners of ours, and we'll say, hey, we have this amazing challenge that you could put your engineers or your designers or your business analysts to, but that challenge is going to cost you to get to, and it's going to cost you because it's going to take your time. And going without a begging bowl, but going knowing what you're worth totally changes the dynamic, and we've managed to leverage a huge amount of value through these partners. And because it's all open source, as a fundamental principle, nobody can come and claim that it's unfair practice, that we're giving one person more opportunity than another. And actually, the open source lever has been a very important one in our arsenal. So actually, by combining sort of knowing what we're worth with these partnership sort of networks that we have, and making sure that whatever we build is open when it's built, so that anybody has a fair chance of bidding on it. Sorry, this is getting very concrete, but like it's true. It's the world we live in. That everything is documented well, and that it's open and it's accessible, so that we're not limiting the market for anybody. Those are sort of the 3 corners of the strategy that we've used to punch far beyond our weight, I think, in terms of the number of people we have on our team.
Nigel, you mentioned that other UN agencies, for example, have tried to do this but haven't necessarily gone there. What are some of the biggest hurdles that you've seen?
I think Chris made some really good points about sort of knowing your value, right? And ultimately, I mean, the biggest challenge for any operating agency or company, for that matter, is that you always have ambitions larger than your workforce and time already. So prioritization is always the name of the game. And so ultimately, it is a matter of deciding what the priority is for being able to do innovation and do this kind of work. And one of the unfortunate challenges of being in purely humanitarian spaces is that everything's a priority right now, because either you convince yourself that lives are on the matter every time you act, lives are on the line every time you act, or it's just a tenet of your donation, your asks, the work you do to justify your existence as an organization. And so I think one of the reasons UNICEF's been able to act a bit on this, frankly, is because you also have the development mandate, right? I could be wrong, but I think there's a breadth of mandate that is beyond simply the acting in the moment. So if you look at pure humanitarian, or effectively pure humanitarian agencies like WFP or UNOCHA and otherwise, there's a lot more pressure to let's not spend time trying things and failing, but to move ahead. That said, insightful management can deal with that in a lot of ways and protect it and curate it as a culture. So that's one of the things. The other one of which is that you can actually innovate without having to do it internally. You can outsource a lot of the innovation, but you still need a core whose responsibility it is to, as Chris said, to own the problem and to own that value piece. But you've got to be very smart, and it's very easy to let others dominate and define what the problem is for you if you actually partner on the innovation and definitions. And so I think a couple of groups have tried to do that and failed, for the reason they didn't actually quite know very clearly in their minds what they were trying to do and how, and they weren't happy with the results. They sort of outsourced the innovation and said, come back to us with something exciting, right? And I see that actually at Google quite a bit. I have people come and say, I get 2 approaches, and it's interesting because I've been on the other side, so I get to sort of laugh a bit when I see the approaches come in. One of which is, hey, I've got this thing I wanted to get done, can you give me free labor and engineers and code, right? that's not interesting to UNICEF. I mean, occasionally an engineer might want to spend a bit of time, but that's not a substitute for procuring help, right? It's a very unreliable workforce, even if they're really high quality, awesome people. Similarly, for advice on architecture, et cetera, that's, again, you get a little bit, but it's unreliable, and it's not, you know, you're not aligning with actually what's of value to Google. Occasional people might be satisfied with it, but it's not aligned. So if you count on that for an innovation process, it's not going to go somewhere. Or it's simply a, hey, there's a big problem here, can you go and work on it? And again, it's not admitting what's the alignment on what your partners need. And I think Chris spoke a bit more eloquently than I could on it.
And maybe I can add one point to that.
definitely.
Nigel. And so this is a story, one of the things that I didn't talk about, but it's about a project called Rapid FTR, and Family Tracing and Reunification is what FTR stands for. And it's in the same space as Person Finder, but it's they're very different parts of that space. And it also sort of came about, the genesis of it was because of the Haiti earthquake. Family tracing and reunification is what happens after an emergency. So you have a bunch of kids wandering around with no families, and child protection workers will come up to the kid, write down their name, and try to get whatever information they can from them, and the kid may be too young to remember all of that. Take a photo of them, as Nigel said, put that up on a photo wall, and try to reunite the kid and the family. And one of the ways, so that's a problem space, and we're like up until a few years ago, we've been using carbon paper and film, right, like actual film. You have to stop bath.
I should say I worked on this during the tsunami in 2000.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big problem space. The fact that we're using carbon paper is great for 1950, but like doesn't quite make sense in Aceh, right? And what we found the value of emergency was to us, because our team does often work in development, but my boss at the time thought every day was an emergency. He's a wonderful man. But so for us, we were in an emergency atmosphere anyway. But the Haiti earthquake happened, and we had all these people come to us, and Google and everybody else said, hey, can we give you one engineer or half an engineer or a quarter of a designer? This thing is happening right now. We want to do something good for it. And our strategy there was actually delayed gratification. We said, like, yes, this is a problem space. We would like to connect you to it, but we're not going to make any solution for Haiti in the time between now and the next 2 months. What we can do is connect you to a project that our students started at NYU's Design for UNICEF class like a year ago. They built out an architecture, and you can start building a project which will eventually help in the next emergency. But it's not going to help now. And that was a very important movement for us. We learned a lot from that, because when you say that, you don't get bound into the thing like it has to work, because it doesn't need to work. But you also give people a more legitimate entry point into your world where they can learn about the problem. That project has leveraged developers in an open source community on 6 continents. I mean, it's been amazing, and we're paying a lot of money for it, because open source stuff is good, but it's free, like kittens are free. Right? So it's like, and it'll like poop on your floor a lot, right? But we've managed to leverage the energy that came out of it, and the need from Haiti, and those concrete things, and get an open source community that we fund the core of. And it's a lot of money that goes into a project that does family tracing and reunification, not only for UNICEF, but ICRC is part of it, SAVE, UNHCR are all collaborating on this architecture, and that's a pretty amazing thing for anybody who knows humanitarian work. And we're paying for the driving engine of it, but it has a community behind it. And so there's a way to leverage some of the instance that we see into a much longer narrative. But it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of pressure back against somebody who says, I want this done now.
Excellent examples, and I'm waiting for the Twitter feed to get crazy with that comment about kittens.
I stole it from somebody else
I
in the
know.
open source tradition.
But we do have, I believe, some questions online, but also if you want to ask questions, please raise your hand here in the audience, and I'll put you down on the list. But take one from the audience first. Who? John?
You both teach design and design principles. One, actually, 2 different, hopefully not competing institutions in New York City. Collaborating.
Yep.
As U.S. agencies begin to step into this space and figure out how do they engage in operations with groups that are providing these type of innovative spaces, how does the project management differ? How does an agency put itself into a design mindset and approach these problems in sort of concrete steps that they can use to approach these problems?
I actually think it's an incredible challenge, because it doesn't fit a normal procurement model for an agency. I mean, having worked with the Red Cross, the World Bank, and a couple of other groups on contracts or arrangements, grants, whatever you want to call it, with Parsons, see a number of challenges. And one of the biggest ones is that by intention, a design process, you actually don't know the answer when you go into it. It's not like you're trying to come up with a UX design for a problem you've already solved. The kind of design thinking approach, at least when you're doing design strategies, is you actually step back and say, actually, the real important piece is actually the research piece at first, which you have to do collaboratively. And so, and that might be research within a very tight bound, which means you've defined your problem to a limit and then you iterate beyond it. But then there's also what you invariably find if you get design strategists involved is they'll actually start unpacking things that you thought were resolved and move it backwards up the chain a bit to actually get at more root causes that might not be actually addressed by where you are. IDEO talks about this regularly in the way they do their design practice. And so one of the things that we've had to do with the World Bank and the others is to sort of talk about you have to change the outputs of a contract or a procurement to be not sort of objects that get delivered, but plans, concepts, and strategies that come out of it. Right? And if you guarantee yourself on objects to be delivered, then you're going to get something that doesn't match the template you've put down, invariably, because someone might decide actually a T-shirt design is actually the solution to your funding problem, whereas you thought you were going to do something else, right? And so forth. And that happened to us with the Red Cross, whereby they actually came and said, look, we've got real problems with our operations. And it turns out that the problems with operations are about funding outside of emergencies in the New York Red Cross. And one of the best ways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you step back and suddenly, okay, that's the tactical problem, but there's a deeper root cause here that we can attach in a different way. And so that's my comment there. And also changing the expectations that having a collaborative design workshop with all the stakeholders basically is where you actually resolve on the problem somewhere through something like a course or a project. So that's actually where you get your resolution, and that's one of your deliverables. But it's not easy to, you can't write that up front.
Yeah. And so maybe I can talk just concretely about this class that we teach at NYU. I started it with Clay Shirky about 5 years ago. And operationally, the way we did it, NYU, big bureaucracy, UNICEF, big bureaucracy, is that we just did it. It seemed like an interesting idea. He was teaching there. We found a course that we could scrape out the title and leave the course number, and we just started working on it. And the most important thing, I love that class. We're teaching it now. If anybody's in New York Thursday mornings, let me know. You can come and sit in, maybe. Depends how good it is this year. They're great students. But the reason I teach it is not to get solutions for UNICEF, even though it's called Design for UNICEF. And I think it's super important. Like, a lot of people are now thinking about engaging academia in this way. I'm not interested in being a client in that class. I'm not interested in bringing other people in as clients, and I'm not interested in the students producing solutions. Sometimes they do come up with nice solutions and solution spaces, but the point of the class is pedagogy first. And the second point of the class is actually infecting UNICEF staff with new ways of thinking about problems. So we bring in our technical experts, and they talk to the students, and they get a lot of these tools that Nigel's describing, these just sort of design thinking skills out of it. But never do we say that, like, this is a class that's supposed to design a better water point or a better latrine or anything else. Like, if we want to design something like that, if we want to design a product or a solution, we should pay a consultant to do it. So that's particularly not the point of that class. It's a great opportunity, though, if you have somebody on your staff who likes teaching, or if you like teaching, to get involved with a university in that type of way, which is not as a consultancy, but is a really foundational type of way. And I think it's the way that you're engaged in Parsons, too.
Yeah.
It's an amazing opportunity. And these problems are now open enough and big enough in their scope that they really appeal to students. The types of spaces that we're working in are the most pressing problems that their generation is going to face as well.
Probably one example I can give to build on that is the work we were doing with the World Bank, which started out as a fairly scoped intervention in some work on a separate project. And so someone participated and they said, that's kind of interesting. And so we talked and said, okay, well, let's run a class, just like you said, on design for the World Bank. But let's focus it a bit to a particular problem space they had, which was going to be microinsurance and index-based insurance, where they had a lot of issues, all kinds of ways. But the point of the class, as Chris said, is pedagogy. I keep stumbling over the pronunciation of that damn word. But what's come out of that one class is now an ongoing series of engagements, because it's resulted in the education and changes in thinking and learning on both sides. And so the World Bank now brings designers from Parsons and outside designers down into DC here to work on scoping strategy around a bunch of projects. And there was an ongoing series of workshops and work that resulted from that with non-Parsons designers, but contracts, to run design, interventions in Uganda for the Nile Basin. Some of this is communication strategy design, some of it's just pure operational background thinking design. And it's led to, it's a slowly evolving cascading series of, okay, we can innovate and think differently. And it's an infection, frankly, and it's a good one.
Yeah, and in a way, I mean, the fields of development and of academia and of design all are drastically in need of a reboot. Like, those are three crumbling fields. And somehow putting them together makes a really, really interesting conversation happening. Am I allowed to say that?
Yes, you are.
Yep.
You're allowed to
Crumbling.
say anything as long as it's correct. I'm Icelandic. I say things as they are. Speaking of students, we actually have quite a number of students from Tech Change watching online. So you may have a lot of people showing up for that invitation that you gave. Do we have someone monitoring the questions online?
Christopher New there in the back.
Then we'll get to you, Rob.
Yes, if we could do 2 or 3 questions online to make sure that they're covered.
Want to do one?
Yeah.
Two quick ones, actually, from one of our current courses on emergency management. Sorry, my name's Christopher New from Tech Change. One of the questions is for Chris Fabian. What lessons were learned on setting up structures to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness or impact of the projects implemented? The other question, also for Chris Fabian, asking about the Twitter-like structure that you set up in terms of internal knowledge sharing with lots of people providing different answers. Whose voices had more authority, and was there a consistent way of ranking it?
Cool. Let me just answer the second one first, because it's sort of easier and more concrete. And monitoring and evaluation scares me, but in a good way. Like, it's a good type of fear.
I used to work for the UNICEF Monitoring and Evaluation Unit for a little while, if that helps.
That's why we can hang out. Right? So in the Twitter one, there's a lot of information about it. If you search for Project Mwana, M-W-A-N-A, online, or you look on UNICEF stories, there's a lot of information about what actually happens in that engagement. It's really one-to-one interactions between health workers, so we don't give a whole lot of authority. What you do see is emergent behavior where you have we call them super CHWs, super community health workers, no cape. But the super CHWs often do provide more and better information to their peers. But we don't engage in it. We don't necessarily guide those conversations. They happen on the ground without us. But you can pull a lot of stuff from the data that's coming out. So check that out online. The answer to the monitoring and evaluation question is hugely important for this, because anybody who's doing in their NGO or international NGO or international organization, anybody who's doing innovation, whatever that means, I still don't know, but we'll figure it out, is going to be asked at some point how they justify their existence. And especially if they're in the unlucky position of having a whole bunch of money and a budget under their control, they're going to be asked that question even more acutely. 2 answers to it. 1, we make sure that we have a very small budget on our team, that we have a very, very small operating budget. Sounds funny. It's not actually a joke. It's true. And the reason is that when projects work, they're paid for and they're funded. There's a lot of money out there for real solutions to these problems. The Rapid FTR project is funded by a grant from the Humanitarian Innovation Fund in the UK. That's not my money. I'm not paying for it. Somebody else evaluates the worth of these things, whether it's a country office or a government or a funder. That's thing 1. Thing 2 is that we're working very closely with experts on monitoring and evaluation, particularly of technology initiatives, to tease out some of the issues. And we'll be putting together our results and our findings from that framework in the next few months, but it's a discussion that we have. Engaging students in the community health worker monitoring was the best thing that we ever did. We worked with Boston University and a bunch of people also from McKinsey to do baselines in all of these health centers in Malawi and in Zambia. And by having that baseline, which is not something that we normally do as our team, because we're like, run, 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 innovate. Oops. By having those baselines, we could show that there's almost an order of magnitude change in the time that it takes to get a test result delivered back to an infant, because we did the baseline at the beginning. So the most important lesson we've learned is, like, take the time to get somebody, even if it's not you or your organization or NGO, to get that data at the beginning. Even if it's like a shifting baseline, things change, whatever, at least you have something to measure against.
And one actually for the panel this time. We have a question from Mariana in Ukraine in our digital organizing class. And her question was pertaining to looking at connecting grassroots to government, and how a lot of the examples we've looked at thus far have been around the US or Europe. Can these lessons be applied universally, or are there differences in terms of the conversation topics that you've mentioned today in terms of what would affect that?
I think most of the things we've talked about on our panel today have been non-US, so I think it's the perfect example that yes, it's explicitly driven outside of the US as well as inside the US. And I just say that the open data story is not one that just works in the US. So even if, I said that's one of the preconditions, so either working on open source projects or just open data projects that other people can innovate on top of, those kind of platforms have been a government push in a lot of countries, particularly Western countries. No problem. Everybody's evaluating, was it worth it? Is the effort there? Because you've got to see some results, of course. But countries like Kenya, for instance, are doing that with open docs, with publishing a whole pile of their local documents in other ways. So it's not something that is just a pure type requirement of sort of Western governments and so forth. And I think it's really important that also it's not just restricted to governments, because service providers of all kinds, this applies just as well to them if it's an international NGO delivering health services in Malawi, or the Red Cross or UNICEF or the governments that are involved. And often you'll find that the capacity and most of the data is actually held by the agencies on behalf of the government. And so they're the ones with the technical capacity to foster a lot of the innovation that needs to happen around it. And ownership's a really important part of this to make sure that that's done right.
So just on that note, we don't hold government data. Governments hold their own data. In these projects we've developed, what we will do is incubate the talent. And so like the example in Nigeria, I think is a great example of that. Right? Mohammed Pate, head of primary health for Nigeria, stole our 2 programmers from us, from UNICEF. And that was the best thing that's happened to our extended team. I mean, that's a huge story, because that suddenly shows, and it's back to the monitoring question, that there's a real need in a government for the type of skills that we can incubate. And we may have the network to incubate those skills, but we don't want to hold on to them too long. And so I think that's an interesting, and it goes back to what Nigel was saying about this different way of thinking about things that puts yourself back a little bit further from it. And that's a difficult movement for everybody. I mean, everybody has some ego invested in it and some of their time and their credibility. And some people don't want to pull that. I don't want to pull myself back from it. And that's one of the most difficult maneuvers that we have to deal with again and again on our team.
I'd probably also say that there's such a huge connection between design thinking and what I was calling inverse incubation and everything else, and traditional best practices in development as well. That community development practices are very explicitly on the ground, in community, participatory if you do it right, and they're about generating and sharing knowledge for local action. So a lot of what we're talking about is how can technology aid or assist that and innovate. I'd probably put one caveat here on the open innovation piece, which is simply that just because we can doesn't mean we should. There are some actually really great examples about applying mapping technology to local communities, trying to open up and share and extract information from communities in a way that's actually not appropriate. That local ownership of their content and information is actually really important, and that you can make an argument for disaster preparedness or response or all kinds of things. Having that more open is really useful. But we get too easily stuck in the concept that actually we want all the data open, whereas actually we're trying to enable the community to be empowered to share, and the methods might be quite different in local situations. So I guess that's another call for a local context for this stuff, because it's very easy to, for instance, to imagine that if you do community risk reduction all over the world, that in different countries and communities, you want to just get all that data centralized so you can make more efficient decisions in some sense. Whereas actually the efficiency of the decisions needs to be made locally. And you don't necessarily need to have the overhead of having it stored somewhere else.
And that's okay. Like when I say openness, I do not think that every government's data should be open and that every type of piece of information should be open, like at all. Because some of that openness will impede process. But I think it's very important for us to figure out what we need to be open and what's best to be open, and what is part of a larger process of discovery and development that isn't necessarily an open process. So I think that's thank you. That's a good articulation to that.
We'll take a couple more questions. Rob, you've been waiting patiently.
Thanks, guys. Thanks especially for talking about how to build technologies embedded within communities. It's great to hear about how that can be successful and also how it can fail. Thank you for the candidness and the limits on openness. I think that's also something we needed to hear. My question's about Malawi in particular. So with the message in between community health workers, what languages are you seeing people use? Is it or Chichewa, or is it more local languages? Is it a bit of English? And how do you think that affects the community uptake in that they're not forced to communicate in the prestige language?
I'm not close enough to the project to give you the perfect answer to that, but I can connect you to the project manager who would know better. My impression from the last time I looked at it, a lot of the messaging and discussion was SMS English, like textlish, English, whatever that is, right? A lot of it was that because the community health workers are talking to each other, they're already kind of a super served part of the community. And because it's in the medical-ish space, like it's, right, English is kind of where they would, textlish is kind of where they would go for that. But the framework, that rapid SMS framework, works in whatever language you want to use, whatever characters. You're gonna have fewer characters in Arabic, but they can text in whatever they want. But I think that the majority of those were in textlish.
So I can actually give a counter example. So the GeoChat system instead built and runs throughout community health workers in Southeast Asia for Cambodia, the Mekong region, etc., is almost identical to that. It's been around for a few years. And I know that a good proportion of that chat actually happens between health workers and facilitators in Khmer or Thai, in local scripts and language. The phones and the system both support it. So I think it
the
depends.
answer is that they should be able to support whatever, and in different
and then
different
the
places
local community
it'll be
does whatever the community practice operates on is what they'll use.
But imagine how bad that system would be if they'd said you can only use English.
Yeah, it would have been horrific, right? Because you're already choosing a literacy requirement up front to be able to use text messages, and pressing beyond that is just a nightmare.
Leah, question?
So you talked about the difficulties of open versus protecting the communities in which you're working. Could you comment on the humanitarian principles and the application to the crisis mapping digital volunteer community and what's being done in that regard?
So last time I mentioned do no harm, I got yelled at online, which I thought was really a bit unfortunate. But I still stick by that, which is the fact that you have to have a duty of care in this space very particularly when you're thinking about it. And that applies to your questions about privacy, safety, security, etc. And it's like any do no harm, I mean, to go back to the basics of where it comes from a medical profession, it's a don't intervene unless you've actually got a positive choice to make rather than just for the sake of it, right? No intervention is often better than an intervention where you're unsure, which actually contradicts the experimentation principles as well. So they're really hard to balance. And so your innovation design and localization of that is absolutely critical for a participatory approach. And you can't understand the possible knock-on effects of something without getting local, without involving in the early stages the people who it'll affect directly. And too many projects have the unintended consequences. You can't remove it completely, but too many projects have the headquarters design approach that, oh my God, I forgot that people, for instance, want to write in Thai, right? And that leads to a whole pile of other incidents. Chris might actually have some more concrete examples. I have some from Afghanistan where we built out some text message systems where it would have been very easy to say that allowing text messaging and information to flow would have been really superb. But if it led to people, for instance, carrying those documents that resulted from that in their cars when they were stopped and picked up, so thumb drives, for instance, are an object that the Taliban will use for targeting of people stopped in roadblocks. And if you demanded that files be moved around by thumb drive, you were going to end up with a really massive problem. So we built a sync system that used thumb drives, and partway through it's like, actually, that's not going to work between Kandahar and Kabul, right? Even though it's an obvious way to move data around.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can, if there's a more explicitly specific version of that question, I could answer it better, but I would say just very loosely and broadly that in some of the places that we work that are really unpleasant and difficult to work in and sort of, there are horrific and violent consequences to certain activities that you might not anticipate. Again, you have to look at this as a process. Like designing these solutions is not a like you just go and do it and it's done, especially in some of these very fragile states. It is like locks on a canal, and there are parts of it that you can do better in one place and parts you can do better in another. And we also have projects which we kill or which just die all the time. Unfortunate choice of words. We have projects that do not go forward because we get a sense that there's some an implication of harm or hazard in them, and we suddenly start to be very careful about that project, and we'll move it to a different place and start incubating a different part of it. But I think it follows what it follows what you're saying.
Yeah, and I should be clear, so me stating do no harm is only just a small subset of the broader humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, etc. And technology and information sharing, particularly in conflict, becomes problematic because it is an intelligence source. And by definition, that can be used for targeting. And there's a classic example from Libya, and I could get this wrong, so I better be careful, I can't remember who provided the service, so I'll just put that disclaimer in front of, it wasn't a sort of humanitarian or UN agency, suggesting that local school children and others and people sort of basically which streets are safe to walk down because of snipers. Right? But that then also provides targeting information if it's public. And so explicitly it's helping locals look after each other, but it's also having a much larger knock-on impact in ways that, I mean, we go, ooh, instantly, that's fine. But clearly someone didn't go, ooh, instantly. And there's an endless number of those kind of problems and choices. And so, yeah, it's very easy to get into trouble with information sharing, particularly in conflict. And that's not even considering the knock-on effects of medical design and all kinds of problems.
And at the end of the day, technology is the smallest part of any of these systems. And we and many of our colleagues actually know how to do our jobs in humanitarian disasters or emergencies very well. Right? There are very, very effective parts of the system. And one of the things we just keep saying is like the technology is not it. Like, what would you do on paper? What would you do in your day-to-day? And we work within, we work with that as a starting point. So I think keeping the technology as like it's a glittery thing and it's nice and shiny, but it's not going to immediately change a whole environment. It's there's a complex human system around it that needs to be dealt with. That's the ecosystem that you're working in.
Yeah. And I realize that Chris and I have now completely veered off to the non-US context, where there's actually a bunch of innovation happening in the US and there's lots of different projects. And so,
and I actually would pose a challenge to the room. I think that one of the most interesting spaces in the next year is going to be looking at pulling some of the innovations happening in other parts of the world into the US. I was just at the Mayo Clinic earlier this week, and looking at, we were talking about innovations in healthcare. And one of the things that was presented in front of plenary at the Mayo Clinic at the Transform conference was some of the work around user-centered design being done in Malawi and Zambia. And that was really interesting to me. That's a different dynamic of discourse. So I actually think that there's a lot of, in many ways, the countries in the context that we're talking about have leapfrogged parts. These are all, as sort of we heard earlier, like these are all slices of a big system, but they've actually leapfrogged parts of those systems tremendously. And we can learn a lot here from work that's being done there. So I would put that forward as a huge opportunity space if people are...
So let me give a concrete example that's been an ask of mine since 2005 in the US, which is simply that with M-Pesa or even just simply in Central African Republic or the Congo, you can do everything from pay bribes to whatever via text message transfers. Of course, pay bribes was sort of the initial piece. Now it's a massive multi-billion-dollar payments mechanism, system, banking, etc. in many countries. In the US, we still hand out ATM cards and prepaid credit cards to victims of disasters. And in Katrina back in 2005, and it's no different for other places right now, you're pretty screwed if the ATM is no longer working where you live or the shops aren't open to take that. Right? Access to cash doesn't happen that way. And so talk about a leapfrog, that if that same thing happened in Kenya, and there's good examples of this actually with smaller disasters, that people just do the payments, you do disaster remittances electronically. And that enables people to operate and rebuild their lives very quickly and effectively.
I mean, and a more personal one, like right, when I talk about reducing the turnaround time for a result for a mother in Malawi, and it's like 60 days down to 16 days, and that's nice. Like if anybody's gone for medical tests and not heard those results back and been terrified for a few days, that turnaround time is really important. And we're not good at that here either. So I think across from very personal to very kind of systemic, there's a lot that we can learn from what other people are doing in other contexts.
So I don't pretend that solving that mobile transfers system in the US is going to be quick or easy.
I know that this created probably a lot of good questions and follow-ups, but unfortunately we're out of time. So you're going to have to snag the two gentlemen as they leave. But I think Chris left us with a great challenge, which is let's stop the north-north and north-south innovation. Let's start the south-north innovation. In other words, bring some of that great innovation that's happening in especially disaster-prone developing countries and bring that in here, because there's a lot we can learn. We've also heard a lot about the fact that it's important for us to collaborate across organizations, to work well together to address those complex problems. And I think our challenge is that now we've talked about it, next time we get here, maybe a year from now, let's have done something about it. Let's go from talking to doing, and let's do it together. With that, I want to thank those two rock stars, and the other word was what, lover, for the